Books of Enderal, the Butcher of Ark. Chapter 6, The Silver Cloud. One of Calian's skills that I never learned to understand was to get by with almost no sleep. During our journey he went to bed late after midnight, and he always managed to be awake before me, mostly long before dusk. It started with a half-hour-long prayer in a language I did not understand. Then he practiced with his scimitar for a good hour, and a bit longer on 2 days of the week. After that he took a bath, or when there was no river or lake nearby, he sprinkled some water over himself. Finally he prepared a breakfast of cereal pulp mixed with bitter herbs, which he meditatively devoured, as if all the mysteries of the Pyreans were hidden in it. I guess he only slept a maximum of 4 hours per night, and I wondered how he managed to look healthy and energetic, like after a bath in the waters of Enderal. On our journey he had let me sleep, but on our first day in Ark he woke me up early in the morning. My limbs felt leaden after the night of carousing. For a moment my sleepy gaze tried to find the water trough that I had used to wash myself every morning in Fogville. Then I realized where I was. I groaned, shoved myself out of bed, and looked outside. By the right path, how late is it? There was no sign of the sun yet. As if he had read my thoughts, Calian had answered my question. 2 more hours before the cocks crow, my friend, before you say anything. He was about to strap his sword to his waist. It is necessary. We have an appointment. I wanted to answer, but only a sullen murmur left my mouth. Calian continued. Meet me in an hour in front of the last house of Cloud Alley. I will wait for you there. He left the room before I was able to reply to anything. For a moment I was baffled and kept sitting on the edge of my bed. Then I stood up with a sigh and went over to the window. Absent-mindedly I looked over the roofs of the sleeping city. No cloud hid the silver light of the moon, and despite the early hour there were several people on the streets. I withdrew into myself. In fact, I felt quite well despite the headache that was the result of heavy drinking the night before. I rarely thought about the events in the Red Ox anymore, but now I remembered Calian's words. You have felt their crimes and their guilt, and the ecstasy was the reward for your courage. It was the nectar of their sins. Could this be the reason why the murder left me cold? Because it was justified? I thought, please no. I thought something good. Uttering a cheerful and at the same time desperate sound, I shook away the thoughts. Instead, I looked at the activity below. I saw the 3 emaciated children carrying heavy sacks along the big street that led across Ark. Directly behind them, 3 armored figures, most likely guards, were patrolling. 2 women, one of them big and muscular, the other one slim, were pulling a wheelbarrow with a barrel and 3 bundles of hay into an alley that led to the rear exit of the tavern. Full of thoughts, I turned away from the window and got dressed. After I had eaten a meal in the tap room, I started on my way, feeling a mixture of curiosity and anxiousness. I do not want to bore you with unnecessary details of my first journey through Ark, for you probably know already where the streets are situated. I did not know then. Only after a guard eyed me suspiciously and pointed me towards the half-decayed warehouse, I realized where I was, and that I arrived 15 minutes before the appointed time. Cloud Alley, as the builders of the city had named it without any apparent reason, marked the end of the artisan quarter. It was the way which led to the large stone gate that every decent upper town citizen never hoped to enter. It marked the entry to the Undercity. I looked around insecurely. I knew about the Undercity from countless stories, including Calian's. It was a place to be avoided unless one was dealing with concealers or criminals or living in such poverty that one of the shabby huts down there was the only affordable home for you. Regardless of how I imagined the contrast between the beautiful capital and the misery of the Undercity, my thoughts always included a kind of transition between prosperity and poverty. But there did not seem to be such a thing. Looking up, I saw the impressive Myrad Tower, where wealthy travelers arrived in the city or departed to other places on the eponymous winged animals. Next to me, a small waterfall came pouring down, and if I had walked up the small alley again on which I had left the winding marketplace a few minutes ago, I would have found myself in the heart of the artisan quarter. Irritated, I again looked at the wooden door, which was guarded by 2 heavily armed men. Was this door really the entrance to the other unpleasant world? I had felt a hand on my shoulder. Calian. You found it. Very well, he said. Are you ready? I squinted my eyes. Now I knew that my first lesson had to do with the Undercity. But what exactly was expecting me there? I think so. And what are we going to do? Calian chuckled. Quite simple, my friend. He took the knapsack from his shoulders, went down to his knees, and started to search for something. Then he looked up to me again. We are going to have fun. Any doubts I may have had that the Undercity was indeed behind the large, guarded wooden doors vanished a few moments after the guards had granted us entry. They must think that we are crazy, I thought as both wings of the door swung open. No citizen of the upper town went there voluntarily, for it was well known that the Order and the Guard were virtually powerless down there. Unofficially, everyone knew about the silent agreement between the Order and the Relata, the association of shady characters. You stay among yourselves, and we stay among ourselves. Therefore, the Undercity was a town within a town, and it was much gloomier than the Ark overground with its rustic but cozy half-timbered houses, fountains, and theaters. Down there, the Relata controlled every aspect of life, and whoever was unfortunate enough to live there, no matter if they wanted to or not, had to bow down to them. Shuddering, I remembered what a traveling merchant once had told me. His story revolved around a young tradesman who only a few moons before had received a coveted badge of the Golden Sickle, which denoted him as a sound businessman. This young man wanted to take the short road to wealth, and with the help of a few lads from Ark, he started to collect glimmercap dust. Its production was more or less an official privilege of the Relata, yet this fact did not keep the young man from sending the group of unsuspecting boys to a cave near the west coast to begin his own unobstructive, as he believed, trade with a deadly droga. For almost a moon's turn, business went well, and his purse was filled faster than the mugs of a popular tavern. One morning, however, when he rode to the grotto where the mushrooms were collected, he found it deserted. There was only a cart with 4 man-sized baskets in front of the entrance. The baskets were filled to the top with glimmercap mushrooms, but they emitted a strange odor. When the merchant told his bodyguard to shovel the content out on the ground, different body parts rolled out of each of the baskets. Arms, legs, torsos, heads. The heads had been cut off carefully so that there was no doubt about their owners. 5 of them belonged to the unfortunate boys who had been hired by the merchant for a modest earning. 2 of the heads belonged to the merchant's daughters. The 8th one was his companion's head. On her forehead the following words had been carved in: Skyrim Relata. The Relata does not forget. They let the merchant live. He was never again seen in the Golden Sickle guildhouse, and rumor has it that he had took his own life a few months later. Thus ended the old traveling merchant's story. And now we are here. I felt uneasy. Everything about us screamed upper town and wealth. Our gestures, our expensive clothes, Callion's dagger. Behind the door, stairs led down into the darkness. It took us more than 15 minutes before we encountered signs of human life. The air was cold and humid. It smelled like ammonia, mold, and wet stones. We came to the end of the long stone stairway. Wooden planks marked a path that led to the tunnel that was about 30 arms' length high. The first hut we had passed had been built so tightly into the natural corner of the rocks that I hardly perceived it. Mighty, dusty rocks came out of the walls and disappeared into the floor, winding around the brittle pieces of wood that the house was constructed of. Chests and barrels, some of them broken, were piled up at the walls that were not boarded up by the stone of the cavern. Meanwhile, more and more inhabitants had noticed our presence. Some of them looked at us with suspicion and swiftly turned their gaze away. While we passed more huts, we even saw constructions with roofs in front of them, probably something like market stalls. Fish, spices, unhealthy-looking bread, and other wares were displayed on them. Callion did not seem to mind the people's gazes. He accelerated his pace and disappeared behind a corner. I followed him, and what I saw took my breath away. Before me was a vast cavern with a ceiling so high that 2 guard towers, on top of each other, could have fit inside. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like icicles of stone. In the distance, an impressive waterfall was pouring out of the crag. Throughout the cavern, houses of dark wood were erected on platforms, connected by stairs and bridges, supported by piers and natural stone pillars. The houses became increasingly higher towards the walls of the cave, so that the scenery was reminiscent of a gigantic amphitheater. In the center, the buildings were erected on a bare stone floor. In form and appearance they differed from the houses on the platforms. I saw a stone building with its high roof and pointed tower. Looked like a small temple. A dozen arms' length next to it was a multi-story building. It was also made of stone, and its windows emanated a reddish, milky glow. Numerous people were bustling about, and even though I had a good look over the round, open space that most likely was the center of the subterranean city, it was so dark that I could barely make out the silhouettes. The Undercity, a name well deserved. A beefy man passed by and bumped into me, suddenly rousing me from my thoughts. I sighed and wiped the sweat from my forehead that accumulated there despite the cold air. Then I looked for Callian, who walked ahead. I found him at the foot of the stairway beneath a leafless, crooked tree. He was talking to someone. Hastily I went down the stairs. As I came close to them, the stranger pointed towards me, and Callian made a placating gesture. Only when I came close, I realized that it was a woman. Her hair was short and blonde, a stark contrast to her soft face with full red lips. However, her eyes, I felt something glow in my stomach, protesting, angry. Her eyes were ice-cold blue, so vivid that they seemed to shine in even the faint light of the cavern. Even though they were objectively beautiful, they roused a feeling in me which I was unable to analyze. They appeared cold. Before I was able to consider the voice that sounded inside me again, Callian started to speak. "JL, may I introduce you?" He pointed at the young woman with his open hand, his palm directed upwards. "This is Yelena." I tried to respond, but I failed. Yelena examined me shortly, from head to toe, and then turned her gaze away from me. "He seems to be going to pee his pants. Are you absolutely sure? It's not too late yet." Callian smiled charmingly and nodded. "I am. And you can trust him. You have my word." The woman bit her lips and furrowed her eyebrows. Then she returned Callian's nod. "Very well. Let's go." We started to move. Maybe it was only my imagination, but I had the impression that the number of hateful looks around us had increased. The air and the darkness in the cavern suddenly felt heavier. Callian looked at me over his shoulder. There was no trace of fear or uneasiness in his eyes. In a certain way, they even gleamed with anticipation. But why? I was aware of the fact that there were many shifty people around here. Yet why seemed Callian and our guide to be so familiar with each other? Our destination was a dark alley directly next to the multi-story house with red windows. A sign at the entrance identified it as the Silver Cloud. With determination, the woman stepped into the dark, and we followed her. There was absolute darkness in the shadows of the buildings, and my uneasiness grew when I saw that our guide, at the end of the alley, walked into an even smaller one. This is a labyrinth, and a damn dangerous one. There are no people, only heaps of rubbish and puddles of feces. There are only 2 encounters. First, we saw 2 men warming themselves at a campfire. As Yelena saw the fire from afar, she accelerated her steps and kicked one of the men in his head with full force. He uttered a choked cry and fell down while the other man, terrified, tried to raise himself up against the wall. Yelena did not allow him to. She bent towards him, holding her face close to the face of the beggar, and murmured something about open fire, an alley, and the siblings. When she dashed him to the ground and told us to move on, our second encounter with the human beings in this dark subterranean maze was with a figure that was draped in sheets, leaning on the wall of a house. I barely recognized her because of her veiling. As I passed by, however, she grabbed my thigh with her bony fingers, and I uttered a cry and turned around. She removed a sheet that was covering her head, revealing a face hardly older than my own, but covered by festering, pulsating ulcers, meat maggots. She whispered something that sounded like a craving plea, but only a guttural, rattling noise left her mouth. With a jerk, I withdrew my leg from her claw and hurried after Callian and Yelena. When we finally arrived after what felt like an eternity, I was exhausted, as if I had been briskly wandering for a day. I feared to never get rid of the disgusting odor that stuck on me. Yelena halted at a thick steel door and knocked twice. A few moments later, a hatch opened and the 2 eyes under bushy eyebrows looked outside. As they recognized our leader, I heard the noise of a creaky latch and the door opened. The door guard was an unremarkable man with croppy hair who reminded me of myself in an unpleasant manner. He looked at us appraisingly, but his gestures showed that he was Yelena's subordinate. With relief, I noticed that the building was clean and lit by several candlesticks on the walls. There was even a slight scent of lavender in the air, which after the omnipresent odor of feces during the last hour seemed to me like the smell of Yolanda's hair. Without any conversation, Callian and I were guided along a narrow corridor with numerous closed doors. Despite the dim light that came forth underneath them, they seemed oppressive to me, like holding cell doors. At the end of the corridor, Yelena opened another door. In the room in front of us was impressive. It was decorated with fine furniture and pillows, and a chandelier at the ceiling emitted a soft orange light. There was a haze in the air, and I was looking over the low tables that were surrounded by hassocks. I realized where the scent of lavender came from. Altogether, there were seats for about 24 people, but except for us, the door guard, and Yelena, only 3 other guests sat separately at the tables. drinking wine and smoking water pipes. Soothing harp music came from a corner of the room that was hidden from my view. I started to feel more comfortable again. Maybe this was indeed just a smoker's tavern. Perhaps an exclusive place for even more exclusive customers. Why the exclusive customers should take the troublesome way through the alleys just to smoke a few pipes of peaceweed with a lavender scent I could not tell. I pursed my lips and looked helplessly at Kallian. He only smiled contentedly and slightly nodded towards me. "Have a seat," Yelena said, and she pointed at an empty table in the corner. Then she silently moved away behind a curtain, and the door guard went back to the entrance. I wanted to say something, but Kallian indicated me to wait. We sat down. Furtively I looked around and judged the other guests. 2 men, one of them young, the other one old, and an old woman who wore her hair in a bun. Judging by their clothes, all were wealthy, like ourselves. None of them took notice of us. Kallian took one of the candles on our table and held it underneath the pot of the water pipe. Then he leaned back. Our pillows lay next to the wall and yawned cheerfully. He observed the water pipe with a merry and relaxed gaze. In the pot, bubbles began to emerge slowly. For a while I did the same as him, and then I decided to break the silence. He cut off my words with a gesture and shook his head, almost leniently. "Just relax, my friend." With one hand he touched the pot of the water pipe. "Relax." We waited more than 30 minutes before a chubby man with a friendly smile approached us. He introduced himself as Conthus. The first thing I noticed that his left sleeve of his expensive-looking burgundy garment hung limply down. He only had one arm. As he had put out his right hand in greeting, I noticed several shimmering rings on his meaty fingers. A surprisingly pleasant smell reached my nose, originating from his perfume. It was spicy and sweet. "Please excuse the delay." He started the conversation with a dark, bassy voice that did not match his appearance. "We have many customers today. May I have a seat?" Kallian answered in the affirmative to the pleasantry, and Conthus sat down opposite to us. For a while none of us said anything, and I felt how Conthus's dark, perceptive eyes mustered over me. Then he nodded contentedly. "Well then, formalities first." He took a folded parchment out of his garment, opened it, and studied it shortly. "Jariman Barthilla, 40 winters old, merchant, and, you come from Arazio? Gosh, may I say that your Endralian is very good?" The question seemed to refer to Kallian. He smiled. "Skill comes with practice, I guess." Conthus nodded. "Indeed it does. And there is Jael Thalas, a Razalian as well." I nodded and tried to smile as charmingly as Kallian. "Very well." He folded the parchment again and leaned slightly forward. "Then we begin. Agreed?" Kallian blew out the smoke upwards from the corner of his mouth. Like all consumers of peaceweed, he had slightly misty eyes, but he nevertheless seemed to have a clear mind. "Please," he replied. "For completeness, let me once again explain the rules of the procedure of your visit, which will hopefully not be your last." His voice was friendly, but I could sense a certain sharpness in it. "As soon as you have paid the rest, a servant will." "We have to pay before we receive the services?" Kallian seemed to be indignant. "Thus are the rules, my sir. I am sorry," Conthus replied without lowering his gaze. Kallian looked sourly at the burly man, yet he made an affirmative gesture. Conthus smiled. "All right now, a servant will give you a sign, and then accompany you to your chambers." He looked at the parchment again. "Or rather, your chamber. The girls will be waiting there. Whatever happens next will be up to you." The girls? A shudder went down my spine, and I gave Kallian a nervous gaze. Conthus had noticed my gaze. "Are you well, my sir?" he asked. Before I could answer, Kallian spoke. "He is just a little excited." He looked at me reprovingly. "It's his first time." Conthus frowned. "Well, I understand. As soon as you are done, ring the bell on the nightstand. Wait a few moments, then ring again, and someone will take care about—" He seemed to struggle for a word. "The rest, and that would be it." He let his gaze wander between Kallian and me. "Are there any more questions from your side?" Kallian had a question. "I assume we will leave this place the same way we came in?" "Yes, Yelena will accompany you outside." My comrade muttered sullenly. "I see, and you can guarantee our anonymity?" Conthus gave a short laugh. "We can guarantee that nobody except our attendants will have seen you arrive and leave this place, and you can be certain that our other guests have no interest in talking about your presence. I think I do not need to explain why." Kallian shortly rubbed his chin with his thumb and index finger. He seemed to be thinking. Then he nodded and put out his strong hand to Conthus. Accepted. We have a deal. Conthus smiled happily. First, he shook Callion's hand, then mine. His handshake was strong and firm. Afterwards, Callion took a small, bulging purse from his coat and emptied it on the table. 15 gold coins, you can count if you like. My eyes widened. 15 gold coins? What a fortune! 1 gold coin was worth 1,000 pennies. 1,000 pennies! Enough to buy a decent house or a warhorse of the finest breed. My head was spinning as I thought of the things one could purchase for a sum 15 times higher than that. Yet Callion kept a straight face while he was looking at the shimmering gold. Did these riches come from the treasuries of Callion's mysterious brothers and sisters? They probably did. I uneasily turned my gaze from the coins and looked at our host, who was looking at them contentedly. It will not be necessary. He waved his hand, and a lanky boy who wore a red garment came in from between the two curtains. His head was bowed in humility. As he had reached our table, Conthus only pointed towards the coins. He collected them and swiftly and silently carried them away. After he had disappeared behind the curtains, Conthus spoke again. Well then, indulge yourselves. Colleen smiled and blew out a cloud of smoke. Thank you. Without further words, Conthus stood up and left. Only after 5 minutes, the curtains opened again, and the slim boy indicated to us to follow him. Callion nodded shortly and took a last draw on his pipe. I noticed uneasily he had almost smoked 2 full pots of peaceweed, an amount that could put a cocky, unexperienced bachelor to a comatose slumber for several hours. Callion, however, did not seem to be tired. His eyes had a milky shimmer characteristic of peaceweed consumers, and all his movements were calm. But I also saw a strange, intimidating glimmer in his eyes that I had noticed on the evening when he told me about the nectar of sins. We stood up and walked through the room towards the boy. Even when we stood directly before him, he did not look up, but still bowed his head towards the ground. He turned around, and we followed him to the long corridor that opened behind the curtains. Similar to the hallway which led from the entrance area to the parlor, every 8 arms' length there was a heavy steel door at both sides. Each door had a number above its arch, written on a wickedly expensive-looking badge. We stopped in front of the door number 16. Silently, the boy removed a heavy key from the large ring and thrust it into Callion's hand. Then he bowed shortly, turned around and left. Callion played with the key and then inserted it into the lock. The door opened without noise. The room was ample and luxurious. A chandelier emitted candlelight which was colored by a red paper screen. A pompous canopy bed stood in the middle, and the air strongly smelled of roses and lavender. Even before I noticed the 2 bound girls, a cold shudder went down my spine as I entered the room behind Callion, and the heavy door snapped shut. And before Callion could inform me about the services this place provided, the pieces came together and formed a coherent, terrible whole. I looked around, overwhelmed. My gaze jumped around between the different, unambiguous elements of room 16. The bound girls were on the bed, stark naked, their eyes undoubtedly clouded by a narcotic. The box on a small table containing regular kernels, which I instantly identified as those of holly berries. Even a baker woman from an old Lower Aranth knew about the aphrodisiac effect. Finally, I saw the utensils hanging on the walls. "Do you like it?" Callion asked. He had sat down on a sprawling arrangement of burgundy hassocks. He was barely an arm's length away from the bound girls on the bed, yet he did not look at them at all. In the corners of his mouth I saw a smile that never seemed to cease. "We are going to have some fun." Monster, I thought, bewildered. Without a word, I attacked Callion. With a loud cry, I jumped forward, launched myself on him, and started to strangle him. Callion seemed to not have expected it, and for a moment I thought I had the upper hand. Then, however, he started to laugh, or he tried to. The result was a choking rattle. Full of rage, I increased the pressure, while my face turned into a hateful grimace. But Callion just kept on laughing. His eyes were gleaming of joy and amusement. If I had watched the scene without being part of it myself, I probably would have considered it a fake, an exhibition fight. He had made no effort to free himself from my grasp. "You miserable bastard! You damned piece of dirt!" I pressed harder. I felt the stubbles of Callion's beard prickling my fingers as I squeezed his warm flesh. Yet nothing happened. Callion still laughed, and only after 60 seconds I realized that any normal human being would have been unconscious by now. Yet it did not happen. Nothing happened at all. After a while, Callion's laughter broke off, but not because I had killed him. His face, which had not even turned red, began to show the expression of blissful serenity again. Suddenly I felt helpless and ridiculous. I had never even seen Callian fight, but since the day we had met, I had felt the aura of power which surrounded him like a veil of heat surrounding an open fire. He was dangerous. I took fright. He could kill me, shot through my head. Once, twice, again and again, like a gloomy drum roll. He could kill me. But I won't, Callian said. His lips did not move a bit. Then he put his right hand on my chest, and 1 second later I was thrown back as if a cannonball had hit me. I hit the stone floor hard and lost consciousness.